Welcome to the Mental Wellbeing Show, where we take a deep dive into the wonderful worlds of psychology and mental wellbeing. This episode is with Dr. David Disabato. David is an assistant professor of psychology at Baldwin Wallace University and is a licensed therapist. David has researched extensively on mental wellbeing and published dozens of papers on the topic. In this conversation, we discuss how we can restore optimal well-being in the face of negative life events, the importance of leaning into negative emotions rather than running away from them, and actionable strategies to improve our own well-being today. First place I'd like to start with you, David, is actually just on conceptualizing mental well-being. I understand you've done a bit of work at looking at different models of well-being, but if we could start with maybe a bit of a definition as to what mental well-being is and what we mean when we say that, that'd be great.
Yeah. So, I think like a lot of things in psychology, there's not one agreed upon sort of objective definition. But one that I've started to use is fairly simple: the perceived enjoyment and fulfillment with one's life as a whole.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think kind of the key components for me about that are, first it's about your life, it's about yourself, you're sort of the main character in the story. And so it's going to be about you more than anyone else. It's kind of a holistic overall view of your life. So it's not going to be particular domains of like, work or spirituality or relationships. Obviously that will make up it, but it's sort of this more global attribution. And then that it has sort of emotional and what you might think of as more existential components. So some of it is certainly sort of the emotions that we feel and how often we feel them, but then it also is going to be things about sort of our spirituality and our meaning in life and purpose in life and things like that. And then probably the most important is that it is perceived or subjective. It's something, I don't think that mental well-being is something that can be sort of reduced to some biological level or assessment. It's really going to be something that develops through a person's sense of self and their consciousness, and it's a subjective experience that, someone has moving through the world. And so that's why I think, it's mostly been in the realm of psychology that well-being has come up.
So what I'm hearing is that the different components as to what makes up mental well-being really is kind of individualized. Is that right? Because we've seen like different models like the PERMA model and Riff's psychological well-being model, all kind of say there are these 5 or 6 components that make up well-being, but are you kind of saying that it's more individualistic to the person as to what makes up their well-being?
I do think there are sort of these different sort of psychological needs you could think of that people kind of tend to have overall. And I think that's some of what, Carol Riff and Seligman are getting at is I think we all have these sort of needs for, relationships and social connection. We have needs for making progress towards goals and having a sense of purpose or an overarching life aim. So I do think there's at least the majority of humans have certain psychological needs that, they want met, or when they are met, they'll have the highest well-being. But I do think at the end of the day, it really depends. And that's true of pretty much anything in psychology or social sciences. It's sort of never say never, never say always. And so I think, something that could make one person happy, no guarantee that it would make another. And so I do think there isn't going to ever be some sort of like universal equation for getting happiness or well-being, that it will still at the end of the day be individualized.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense. And I suppose taking in your definition then, the kind of perceived enjoyment and fulfillment of one's life, my experience in having both been taught psychology in university settings, but also in clinical practice, is that the focus seems to be more on mental illness rather than mental well-being. And from what I've observed, there's this kind of inbuilt assumption that in treatment, the goal is symptom reduction. So getting a
Mhm.
patient from -5 to 0 rather than to +5. But, people want more for their life than just to get rid of their symptoms. They do want to enjoy and feel a sense of fulfillment. And
Mhm.
I feel like that's kind of missing, in universities teaching future psychologists and also in clinical practice. So I'm wondering, have you experienced the same, and do you feel that that assumption is problematic?
I mean, I do think it's problematic in that it doesn't get at what I think a lot of clients and a lot of just uh, people in general are looking for out of their lives. That people are looking for things other than just symptom reduction. I do think it's funny when I talk to practicing psychologists and practicing therapists. They usually are more well-being focused, or at least have a balance between symptoms and well-being. It seems to be the academics and the researchers kind of seem to be more attached to the symptom focus.
Right.
And we could talk about why I think that is. There's a few different ideas, but
Mm.
whatever the reason, I do think that people sort of out in the trenches of mental health have a better appreciation for these dimensions of well-being that people come in to want to work on, because you're right that people want things beyond just symptom reduction, and we know from research that the percentage of people who have symptom reduction, or don't have many symptoms at all, is often quite a few. But then the people who, on top of having minimal symptoms, also have these elevations on aspects of well-being, like meaning in life and purpose in life, personal growth, social relationships, all these things. You don't see as many people really high on those. And so there is this clear distinction between symptoms and well-being.
So yeah, and you touched on the difference between academics and practicing psych. So yeah, why is that? Do you feel that there is that difference in the way that they view mental well-being and mental illness?
I mean, this is just a guess because I don't really know. I haven't, you know, tried to do some sort of interviews with academics versus therapists or something. But, there's a famous psychotherapist who said that, even though Freud was wrong about penis envy, us psychologists have physics envy. This idea that we sort of want to be this objective, kind of rigorous, like hard science. And I think that sometimes the field moves in directions that make make them as researchers, and then the field overall sort of look more scientific, of things like, okay, we have this official DSM sort of medical book, and it's got a stamp on it, and we have these official disorders, and if you look at the history of the DSM, it's basically just a handful of famous psychiatrists putting their opinions into a book. Now, there's certainly informed opinions, but there's no in chemistry, they have a periodic table of different elements and atoms that's strongly empirically based. We don't have anything like that. We don't know what really are the components of mental well-being and mental illness, where we kind of have these historical constructs that have stuck around over the decades. And so I think that it's sort of this pull to try to appear more objective, appear more medical and official. And I think sometimes then the more kind of humanistic parts of psychology get de-emphasized.
Hmm. I just read the Book of Woe by Gary Greenberg. I don't know if you've heard of that, but yeah, it just pulls apart the DSM and how so many of the decisions made as to what is a mental illness and what isn't are based exactly on what you were saying, just conversations with different academics and practicing clinicians sitting in a room deciding. So yeah,
Right.
I completely understand that the kind of identity crisis, right, of some psychologists and academics is to want to be a harder science than perhaps what we are. And I'm wondering, where do you feel like mental well-being fits in then? So to me, it sounds like you're saying that academics perhaps feel that mental well-being isn't as hard a science as mental illness. Is that the impression that you get, or generally speaking?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that is the impression I get. I don't know if it's
Mm-hmm.
necessarily warranted, but
Mm.
I mean, I do think, when I say that I study positive psychology, there's certain times I get sort of like, oh, okay, you're doing this kind of fluffy stuff over here. That's nice.
Uh,
So, but I also think, this is really difficult things to measure, and the main way we do it right now is we ask people on, a scale from hell yes to hell no, how much these different dimensions of well-being apply to them. And it's not clear how, you know, valid and accurate people can self-report these things. It's not clear how much that people really understand these terms, as well as the researcher might be. The researcher can pick apart the difference between meaning in life and purpose in life, but does the average person taking a survey distinguish between those? I don't know. So I think, it certainly is challenging to study these well-being constructs, but I mean, the reason that I have stuck with them and continue to study them is I think they are some of the most important outcomes we have in psychology and the things that people care about the most. If you ask people what they want for their children, they often are going to say these different aspects of well-being.
yeah, and on the note of, I suppose, evidence and research, particularly in the last 20 years on mental well-being and positive psych, I've seen a lot of work from Corey Keyes on that dual mental health continuum, and it seems like there's evidence now suggesting that for people without a mental illness, decreases in your mental well-being predict like a later incidence of mental
Mm-hmm.
illness. So I'm wondering, with that kind of assumption in mind and notion in mind, what do you feel like are the protective steps that individuals can take to look after their mental well-being?
Well, one of the recent things that I've been researching are kind of different mental health behaviors. Sometimes we've called them like self-care behaviors. So, we talk about things like exercising and eating fruits and vegetables as good for our physical health. But there's quite a bit of research that those things are also very good for our mental health. And in addition, we, looked at some other behaviors such as, socializing with loved ones, mindfulness or meditative practices, and sort of engaging in some sort of meaningful hobby that's working towards a personal goal. And we found that those things tend to kind of sustain positive emotions on a daily basis for people. And so I do think, those are things that kind of more concrete and daily things that people can do to sort of bolster up their well-being. And I think it's very much similar to what people talk about in physical health. Of these are sort of, you have to cultivate like a healthy lifestyle. I think it's the same way for mental health. It's having these kind of built into our daily routines. Again, going back to what we were talking about with psychological needs, you could think of it as sort of, having these psychological needs met on a daily basis, or sort of moving towards them on a daily basis.
So is that there was a link between certain nutritional kind of habits and mental well-being? Is that right?
There is, yeah, yes. Yeah, I know this is true of, a lot of the emotional disorders, so things like depression and anxiety, as well as ADHD. There's been quite a bit of research on nutrition and sort of attentional control. So, I think that's an exercise. Similarly, the effect size for exercise is the same as antidepressants. If you do an hour of cardiovascular activity every day, it's pretty much like taking a standard dose of your Prozac or Zoloft. And so,
Mm.
I think people aren't always aware of these things, but they can have quite big effects. People talk about feeling, kind of crappy after eating, a bunch of junk food or things like that, and that you feel different emotionally when you've had, sort of healthy variety of foods that are recommended.
So, as a mental well-being researcher yourself, who's published dozens of studies in this area, how do you go about incorporating these kinds of strategies and tips into your own life?
I mean, I think it's certainly prioritizing it, and I think that's some of why we'll use the term like self-care behaviors, because I think that term self-care is associated with sort of, making these things a priority, because they do take time, setting aside time to meditate and exercise and things. I know something I like to do is making time for exercising myself. I mean, I think the other
Mm-hmm.
piece, of where I think really, a key part of sustaining well-being is making sure that we don't sort of give in to different avoidance strategies. And so I think that's another important piece of this. And I think about it in my life frequently, of something that is distressing for us, something that's upsetting, causing us some negative emotions. We want to sort of escape that. We want to run away from it. But what research has shown is when we run away from negative emotions, we also run away from positive emotions, because those same things that cause us distress also cause us joy. Our close relationships, our meaningful work that we're doing, striving towards personal goals. All these things are stressful, but at the same time, they're our greatest sources of happiness, joy, and meaning. And so I think, one of the key things is always, trying to have more of an approach oriented sort of perspective towards life. And when you notice yourself avoiding, of really kind of checking in and being like, am I just trying to escape here? And what am I going to miss out on in addition to just, I no longer have those negative emotions, but what am I also missing out on that's really positive in my life?
Mm. Is this the concept of the psychological flexibility,
It
the
is, yes.
acceptance and
Yeah,
harnessing?
exactly.
What would, yeah,
Oh yeah,
what,
I
sorry,
was
you go,
just gonna
David.
say I think that's kind of sometimes the academic term that's been used of sort of being able to move away from avoiding our distress towards kind of accepting it and leaning into discomfort when it's something that's meaningful to us, something we care about.
So what would that look like? Because yeah, this was really interesting when I was reading up on this particular paper of yours. So what would that look like? Because when I think of distressing situations, I make a mistake at work, and a client is unhappy. It feels difficult in the moment to lean into that. So how can someone, I suppose, do that without, for me, if I lean into it too much, often I find that
Hmm.
I just end up ruminating on it. So how can we kind of, use those approach strategies,
Yeah.
in an adaptive way?
Well, I'll first say that, for people who are interested more in this, just because I know you're coming from an Australia university, Russ Harris, I think, has some great material on psychological flexibility. I mean, he doesn't always use that term, but I think most of what he talks about in his books, like The Happiness Trap, is this exact idea. But, I think that sometimes what can happen is we'll stay in an uncomfortable situation, right? Like some type of, work meeting that didn't go well, or some type of session with a client that didn't go well. And we're trying to sort of still prevent our fears and vulnerabilities from coming out, right? And so we might be worrying or ruminating about, oh, what if they thought of me like this? What if this means this about me, that I'm sort of no good and incompetent and all these things. And I think that really, when we're truly being psychologically flexible, we really let down our guard and we risk potentially these fears coming true. And instead of us trying to still sort of block them and try to prevent them, of just letting them potentially be, like, maybe my boss will be upset with me. Maybe he will think this was crappy work. maybe this person won't like me and won't want to go to lunch with me. Is the worry and rumination is often trying to make sure we're safe, make sure we can escape that distress. And this is the idea that, Russ Harris talks about, of sort of letting go of the rope. We're continually kind of battling against our distress and our emotions, and we sort of keep them alive by tugging the rope on the other end. And can we just drop the rope, not play the game anymore, so to speak? So, I mean, certainly easier said than done is something that I struggle with plenty myself. But I think that's sort of the whole idea behind psychological flexibility.
And you mentioned, because this sounds very, very useful, particularly with someone like myself as well. So you mentioned the happiness trap. Are there other kind of resources or papers by yourself that people could look at, further reading on how to kind of employ these strategies in our lives?
Yeah, I have not necessarily written any sort of trade books or self-help books, but I would recommend, The Happiness Trap by Russ Harris. Another example is one of the researchers I've worked with, and he's actually my graduate school mentor, Todd Kashdan, has a book called The Upside of Your Dark Side, which I think is also very much along this theme of sort of recognizing that these sort of quote negative or distressing parts of ourselves can still bring a lot of meaning and joy to our life. But those are the main ones that come to mind. I can think more and get back to you.
Yeah, no, I'll link those two by Todd and Russ in the show notes for people to have a look at. But I think that's certainly a place to start. And on this kind of notion of strategies to help in challenging times, I was also reading another paper of yours. I think it was a 2017 study, and you found that hope was predictive of resilience in the face of negative life events. But the way that I suppose hope was operationalized was kind of different to what I usually think of in the when I think of the word hope. So can you perhaps elaborate on, the results of that study?
Yeah. So this is work kind of stemming from Rick Snyder, who kind of developed a hope construct that's a bit different than kind of like the traditional definition. So we usually think of hope as like optimism about the future and such. And he kind of put a different spin on it and really talked about kind of having a lot of kind of energy towards our goals and putting a lot of sort of agency behind them, and then also having flexibility when we have setbacks and being able to kind of maneuver around setbacks to keep going towards our goals. And so in some way it's kind of an earlier version of Grit, if some people are familiar with that, by Angela Duckworth. I think in many ways she's kind of building off Rick Snyder's work. And so in some ways it's, more similar to maybe the traditional definitions of like perseverance or self-efficacy than quote hope or optimism. But for that study we compared, gosh, it must have been almost like a dozen different sort of personality strengths to see which were most predictive of resilience in response to negative life events. And hope, again, this is kind of Rick Snyder's construct of hope, popped out as sort of having the biggest effect. And so we really think about that as again, kind of, when someone has these negative events happen, have setbacks, that the person's able to kind of maintain some energy and motivation towards their personal goals and what's meaningful to them, and finding potentially ways kind of around those setbacks. I think one of the beautiful things that Russ Harris will talk about is that you can pursue your values in just about any situation. And so, you can pursue what's meaningful to you in many different ways. And so I think, someone that is high on hope, what they're doing is, okay, maybe their preferred path didn't work out, but they're able to be flexible and recognize, hey, there's this other alternative path I can take to move towards this value or this goal. And instead of just totally dropping it and giving up, I'm going to take that alternative path.
That makes sense. So with this kind of notion of hope, then are there, and actually with psychological flexibility, are there certain like personality, I suppose, traits that predispose people to being more likely to engage in this or more able to engage in this?
I think that, I mean, there's certainly kind of general findings in terms of like the big five personality traits that some people might have heard of before, that certain traits are associated with well-being and happiness. But in terms of, I guess, specifically predicting some of these kind of personality strengths and character strengths, I think that's probably something that's still yet to be discovered in positive psychology. I think, we have a very clear sense that these strengths are adaptive and that they help people be resilient and satisfied with their life. But I think the part that is yet to be determined are sort of what are the most effective kind of interventions or ways of, like raising children and school involvement that would be the best for promoting these strengths. And I know that's something Angela Duckworth is working on, of trying to work in schools and see what types of things are actually improving grit and perseverance in kids. But I think we have a ways to go with that still.
If you had someone who, you know, was had a goal of, look, I really want to improve my mental well-being, and I know I'm oversimplifying, a very complex field, but where would you start with them if someone came to you and said, look, I want to improve my mental well-being? Would it be reading these books? Would it be measuring their hope or psychological flexibility? Would it be improving their nutrition? Where would you start?
I mean, I think I often do start with some of these mental health or self-care behaviors, and that they're sort of the most concrete and can get people some momentum. So,
Hmm.
setting aside and prioritizing time for things like exercise and mindful practices, prioritizing social relationships and developing deeper connections with people.
Hmm.
I think that's often uh, where I'll start, but then I'll very much be trying to kind of identify, do they want out of life? What are sort of their most important values and goals? And then are their avoidance strategies getting in the way? And really trying to be honest, trying to explore with the person, have them be honest with themselves about the things that they're doing to kind of protect themselves and keep themselves safe. And how those, in the short term might feel good, but in the long term are taking away from our well-being. I think another person who does a good job of explaining this idea is Brene Brown. And she has her TED Talk some people might be familiar with, right? She essentially talks about how vulnerability, being vulnerable, is distressing. It's scary. It's we feel like we might experience these negative emotions. We might experience some social shame. But right, Brene Brown's solution is being courageous, right, in the face of that vulnerability, of not running away, not avoiding, but leaning into that vulnerability, because what comes from it are these rich, meaningful experiences that make life worth living. So I mean, that's often where I'm sort of focusing with clients I work on with, is what are their avoidance strategies, and how can I get them to stop those? How can I get them to drop the rope?
Mm. I love it, David. Feels like there's a lot of practical strategies there for people listening to take away and implement. I know I've certainly gathered a few there just in our short time together. Is there anything that you want to add, or any kind of advice you want to give finally, just in wrapping up to people listening?
I guess one thing I would say is, I think sometimes when we talk about mental health and well-being, sometimes people can be led astray by kind of having this goal of trying to get rid of all their negative emotions or negative thoughts. And I think for a lot of people that ends up being a fool's errand of, I think often our problems come more so in our reactions to our negative emotions and thoughts, and the ways we try to run away from them, than the negative emotions and thoughts themselves. And so, something that I often hear people talk about is like, oh, you can't control sort of, what happens to you in life, but you can control how you react to it. And I often think of that on sort of a different level of, I think, yes, largely you can't control what happens to you in life at times. You also can't always control your initial reaction, the initial emotional response, and those automatic thoughts that pop up in our mind. But what you can control is sort of your reaction to your reaction, right? Of like, how do you respond to those, initial emotional reactions, to those initial automatic thoughts? And do you allow yourself to sit with them and lean into that discomfort and still approach what's meaningful to you? Or do you take that as a sign to run away? So I think that maybe is what I would leave people with, of this idea that we can't always control what happens to us in life and our initial reactions, but we can control our reactions to our reactions.
I love it, David. That feels very useful, and again, very practical, and something that we can implement pretty much immediately. So thank you.
Yeah.